Hey minions, welcome to Crank It Up. I'm Jim Price, and today I want to talk about the giant ants. This video was requested by Sam G, and this will be my comprehensive overview of the faction strategy. The worst way I've ever described the Smash Up faction was to call it a Rube Goldberg machine. If you're not familiar with the term, they are overly complicated solutions to simple problems. Think the breakfast making machine from Back to the Future. I won't say what faction made me feel that way, but I would understand if others felt that way about the giant ants. I love this faction, but their game plan is not straightforward. It's harder to pull off than most, and it's fair to question if it's worth the effort, but I believe it is, because when done properly, the payoff is extremely satisfying. I think I've been sculpted by my years of playing Dominion. Yes, you can buy a bunch of gold and then buy provinces to win, but that's so boring. I like creating the engine and seeing it pay off, even when the roadmap seems blurry, and that is why I'm drawn to the ants. Their playstyle is different. It requires precision. You must be methodical. It requires a good partner. They aren't meant to be partnered with everyone, and that's okay. It's probably why they got a Titan. And you have to look beyond the flaws on paper, which seem really extreme when examined under a microscope. I think the worker is the best illustration of this point. The giant ants have a total of 13 printed power, because the workers are 0. They normalize to 29 when you factor in power counters, which is still below the normal 30. And when you look at the worker, it is 2 power total, which means, on the surface, this is just a bland minion, just 2 power, no ability. The worker is great at exploiting printed power, but these abilities are rare. Instead, for the worker to provide value, the value must be in the counters themselves, and this is the point of the giant ants. The worker doesn't give you 2 power, it gives you 2 counters, a different form of currency with a different way of deriving value, and you'll see with the other giant ant cards just what that value is. The next minion is Soldier, who gets 2 power counters to advance to 3 power. The Soldier has a talent that can transfer a counter to another minion. This is essentially a different form of move, as you are splitting your focus on 2 different bases typically. However, it doesn't have to be a move, as you can transfer power counters among minions at the same base, and there are reasons to do both. Occupying the 4 power class is the Drone, who has 3 printed power and only a single power counter. The Drone can use its counter to prevent a minion's destruction, which has its uses, but uncapped destruction is pretty rare. I'd personally rather have the power counter than destruction mitigation, but for the few cards that can destroy any minion, the Drone is there to protect. However, given that power counters are themselves a form of currency, you need to ask whether or not the counter is more important than the minion, particularly if it has no counters. The king minion of the faction is the Killer Queen, who is surprisingly hard to use. I'll have a lot to say about the Killer Queen when it's time for her King of the Hill video, but the Killer Queen can quickly accelerate the number of power counters. Both the Queen and the played minion get one, but there is generally a 1-turn delay before the ability can be used, since the Queen has to be played first. It will take at least 1 talent usage for the Queen to reach normal power levels, with the other minion getting a counter as well. Air Doctor does seem faster and more flexible, but Killer Queen can theoretically eclipse his output. However, the base is rarely around long enough for that to happen. Truth be told, the giant ants are defined more by their actions rather than their minions, although their minions are in service of their actions. In isolation, their minions seem weak, and their game plan is not apparent. It makes perfect sense that the Titan would give them an extra action, because it takes their game plan and speeds it up tremendously. Let's take a look at that game plan, which is a multi-base attack and power persistence. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. When you successfully create the giant ants engine, it is one of the most satisfying moments in Smash Up. To highlight this, it's helpful to actually work backwards, so I'll start with We Are the Champions. We Are the Champions is played after a base scores, allowing you to transfer any number of counters from a minion on the scoring base to another minion. Ideally, this would allow you to break the next base the same turn. You'll notice that is a 1-to-1 transfer, which wants a single minion with a lot of counters. Unfortunately, the giant ants spread their counters out among all their minions, so consolidation is needed at some point. Before you play We Are the Champions, it's helpful to play Under Pressure. This is the action awareness video for the giant ants, and I encourage you to watch that video, as there are many ways you can use that card because of its wording. The link will be in the description below. But by transferring any number of power counters from one minion to another, you can create the singularly large minion that We Are the Champions wants. However, to increase the effectiveness of that transfer, you need to increase the effectiveness of this transfer too. Under Pressure also wants a singularly large minion, preferably one whose power is not needed on the current base, which I'll call base 1. Ideally, power is moved off base 1 as it is scoring and onto base 2, which then has enough power to score. After base 2 scores, the power is moved to base 3, and hopefully that scores as well. If you are playing giant ants, you'll realize that you want to be somewhat competitive before winning on your turn all at once. To facilitate the initial base breaking, there are 2 routes that you can go, routes that are directly in conflict with each other when you have a single action. But both revolve on the same basic premise, spreading out your ants. You need time and minion to establish your engine, and spreading out does that. Without having presence on other bases, Under Pressure and We Are the Champions have no targets. The first is to use a kind of magic to transfer all your counters to a single minion, siphoning power from multiple bases to create the singularly large minion required for excessive transfers. This allows you to math out the exact distribution you need and position your counters appropriately. In this path, I highly recommend using Under Pressure to pull your counters off of a base where you don't need them. The second path involves one of their double features, We Will Rock You. This is a global power boost that can really increase your power on several bases, and it's the reason why counters are currency. Most actions cap out at +2 power per minion, but this can exceed that easily. For most ants, that is the starting point. It's important to note that the power gained is never lost, even if the counters are transferred. For this reason, you can use Soldier's Talent either before or after We Will Rock You to determine exactly where you need the power. The rest of the cards support these 2 paths. Gimme the Prize places power counters on 3 of your minions. When done in advance, this is essentially +6 power on the We Will Rock You branch, 3 for the action itself and 3 for the doubling. By spreading out your minions, you gain multiple counters but do not advance bases quickly, allowing you time to establish your engine. The Show Must Go On is an important defense card for the ants because it protects what are otherwise easily destroyable minions. When their minions die, so do their counters, but it prevents more than destruction. They cannot be affected. This means they cannot be moved to prematurely cut your engine short. Headlong is a good versatile card that can move a minion off Killer Queen's base after it has gotten a power counter. This can generate 4 counters, 2 from Killer Queen and 2 from Headlong, while positioning your minion to receive or supply power counters for your big combo. The last action is Who Wants to Live Forever. I'm not as big of a fan of this action for the ants themselves, although it does have its uses. The problem is that, while the ants are dependent on a few key cards, drawing too many cards to guarantee seeing them requires too many counters. I look to bases and partners for uses of this card. It's a good prelude to Mad Monster Party, a surprisingly restrictive card. And if you intend on destroying those minions for any reason, better to use their counters for something else. This does work well with Heavy Drinker because Heavy Drinker will replenish one of those counters, and at least you are getting cards for it. This is easily the most situational card of the giant ants, but given that half of their actions are endgame plays, there may be chances to play it. What's really interesting about the giant ants is that, despite their 2 main routes being in conflict, pursuing them both is a great option. It prevents your opponents from knowing exactly what to expect. They may try to pick a base you are planning to win first, not realizing that you are going for a We Will Rock You play. With We Will Rock You, you don't always have to try to play We Are the Champions to cascade into another base. You can read the situation and see if it's better to hold on to those cards if the VP splits are not in your favor. One other interesting aspect of the giant ants is a question I see asked a lot. Are they better in 2-player or 4-player? I've seen a lot of great points for both sides, and I don't think there's a simple answer. With 2 players, you have more time to establish your engine because you get more turns, but in 4 players, you have more bases to spread out further and can create time by effectively staying off the contested base. With more players, you also need less power per player, and it's easier to overtake individuals. I think it largely depends on your opponent and your partner faction. I used to think that the giant ants could only function with factions that had power counters, since their cards referenced them so much. However, that's not the case. The giant ants can bring the counters. There are many ways that other factions can support them. Consider the Zombie Lord. Normally, playing minions on other bases where you have no minion is not useful, but the Zombie Lord can create a ton of power counters by spawning all of your workers. With a single play, you just generated 13 power to work with, but in 2 players, your opponent has no place to hide, so if you can force them to be on every base, you can use that power to help break bases as you transfer your counters. The show must go on becomes more powerful because it means less of your minions are unprotected due to having fewer bases. I wouldn't want to play giant ants against a destruction-based faction in 2-player, because I would be the only target. There are a lot of variables, but it doesn't make this faction bad. I really like their playstyle and their delayed explosion. It requires finesse in a way that is very satisfying. As far as their bases go, Egg Chamber helps function as the second the show must go on. While it doesn't provide all the same effects, it does help since destruction is the most prevalent disruption. The hill somewhat works for them as a means of spreading out, even if it is only one directional. I don't think piling ants on a single base is in their best interest, because you want to consolidate counters, not necessarily minions. This helps keep the Killer Queen base light so that you can farm counters longer. I wouldn't put Killer Queen on this base unless you were planning to break it this turn. Then again, Killer Queen should never be part of a big drop anyway. My favorite pairings with the giant ants is no surprise, the pirates. They can break infinite bases. But I also enjoy them with Mythic Greeks, vampires, Kung Fu fighters, tornadoes, disco dancers, mega troopers, Edie critters, and kaiju off the top of my head. Anyone known for extra minion or extra action plays. The kaiju can give them extra action plays, which the ants love, as well as Kaiju Alliance, which plays really well into their multi-base attack. They definitely are an underrated faction because they are much more difficult to use, but they are just so much fun to play. What do you think of the giant ants? What's your favorite pairing with them? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Let's shut it down.